I just want to point out that here on the home page for Ode to Food, we have this Bootstrap carousel that rotates images and rotates panels as we sit here and look at it. And in order for this to work, and in order for me to be able to click on this to manually rotate a panel, this requires some JavaScript to be in place, both jQuery and bootstrap.js. So the question is, where and how do these JavaScript files get loaded by the project? Well, first of all, I do want to point out again that inside of www.root, there is a lib folder, which is where the jQuery library and the Bootstrap library and all the JavaScript that I need, this is where it all lives. So somewhere in my project, I need to load these JavaScript and CSS files from the www.root folder. And the ideal place to do that would be from the layout page of the application. So we've already looked at and talked about the layout page. Every other Razor page renders inside of this page essentially. So if we look here at the top of the layout page, you'll notice inside of the head tag, we have links to bring in the Bootstrap CSS framework as well as our own custom site.css file. Now those two links are wrapped inside of an environment tag, which I'll come back and talk about in just a minute. But before we talk about that, let's scroll to the bottom of the layout page where I can show you. This is where we have script tags to load jQuery, to load bootstrap.js, and to load our own custom site.js file. So this layout page will include in every other Razor page all of the CSS and all of the JavaScript that we need. It will load these files starting at the root of the website, which again means we're going to have to place those files into www.root. Now, as far as this environment tag goes, environment is a special kind of tag helper in ASP.NET Core. So we've also looked at and talked about tag helpers previously in the course. We've looked at tag helpers like ASP-page to help generate a link, ASP-4 to help generate forms. Environment is just a tag helper that instead of looking like an HTML attribute, it looks like an HTML tag, but it is processed on the server. And what this tag helper will do is look at the current operating environment and will only emit the HTML inside of here if a condition is met. In this case, the condition is that the environment would have to be development. Down here, this next environment tag is what happens if we have an environment that is not development. So with ASP.NET Core, you can set up as many environments as you like. You might have an environment for development and one for production. You could also have one for testing and one for staging. But typically the big difference is between development and production. In development, you might have, but typically the big difference is between development and everything else. When you're in a development environment, you want to see stack traces and detailed error messages. When you're in production, you want things to operate fast and you don't want to show users in production detailed error messages that might leak information. So what we have here is a situation where when we're in development, we're going to serve up our JavaScript and CSS files from files that are on the web server and locally on our file system. But when we're not in development, so we're in production or some other non-development environment, we're actually going to try to serve those same files like jQuery and Bootstrap from a content delivery network. So typically the content delivery network will serve up those files with a little less latency and be a little bit faster and hopefully cached for your end user. And this is all just done with the environment tag, which will render or exclude the inner HTML based on this condition. Now, one of the questions you might have is, when I run this application from Visual Studio, how do I know what environment I'm operating in? Well, by default, you will be in a development environment. You can also explicitly open up in the properties section of your project this launch settings.json file. This is a file that can be used from the command line with .NET Run as well as with Visual Studio. And this file controls some of the different environments that you can operate in. By default, when I run here inside of Visual Studio is going to launch my ASP.NET Core application and run it inside of IIS Express. And when it does that with the IIS Express profile, by default, it's going to set an environment variable for that process and set this ASP.NET Core _ environment variable to development. This is the variable that controls your environment. If this variable is missing or not present, ASP.NET Core assumes a production environment, which means you might not receive the detailed error messages that you want. But if I want to see how my site would render in production, I could change this value to production, then save the file and relaunch the website with Control F5. And the other way to launch this website, the second profile down here, is essentially doing a .NET Run. And you can see by default, we'll also set up an environment of development for that scenario too. So now that we know a little bit about how scripts get loaded and how we can use environment tags to switch which scripts are loaded between development and production, let's see how we can take advantage of some additional scripts to add features to our application like client-side validation.